that, I'll hand over to Peter to take us through the presentation of this morning. Thank you.
Marcus, thank you very much. Good morning, buenos dias, bon dia to everyone. Welcome to our virtual briefing today on the Americas. I have some opening comments to make, and then we'll be very happy to take any of your questions. It is quite fair to say that the world has been turned upside down since we last met in Geneva last December. At that time, we were forecasting continued growth for the entire continent. Airlines in North America were estimated to remain on their profitable path, while Latin America, the expectation was that 2020 was also going to become a profitable year. January and February of this year turned out to be that promising start that we were expecting. But then COVID hit us, and it forced us to an abrupt shutdown. And while we fully understand the need of our governments to protect the health of the citizens, no one could have predicted that our industry would have been grounded for an extended period of time, and what an uphill struggle it has turned out to be to get us restarted globally and across this region. The last available figures and forecasts illustrate a dire financial situation for our industry. For 2020, we're now predicting a net loss of $118.5 billion, deeper than the $84.3 billion that we had forecasted back in June. And even looking at 2021, we're expecting a net loss of $38.7 billion, deteriorating from the $15.8 billion that we forecasted in June for next year. When we look at the regional figures, we can see that demand in North America will drop by 66% this year, resulting in a net loss of $45.8 billion. And even with the projected increase in demand in 2021, airlines from North America will still lose around $11 billion in 2021. For the Latin American and Caribbean, the drop in demand in 2020 is expected to be 64%, with airlines slated to lose around $5 billion. Again, even with a recovery in 2021, the airlines in the region are expected to lose around $3.3 billion at the end of 2021. But it is not only the financial performance which is concerning. It is also the loss of connectivity, which will have a direct effect in the social economic contributions of our industry. From the connectivity perspective alone, COVID-19 has had a dramatic effect on this continent. In North America, the number of unique city pairs connecting the United States and Canada within the region and to the rest of the world reduced by almost 2,000 city pairs. In April 2020, there were 3,490 unique city pairs compared to the 5,450 city pairs during the same period 1 year ago. In the United States, connectivity levels were reduced by about 72% in April, reflecting the size of the domestic market. Connectivity in Canada fell by 85% in April. Since then, connectivity has been recovering, although still lagging considerably compared to the pre-COVID levels. The evaporation of demand has, to a large extent, been driven by the fact that only Canadian citizens and residents are allowed to enter the country, and quarantine rules are in place for international arrivals, even in some cases for domestic travel. Restoring air connectivity in North America is essential to support the economic recovery in the region. Air connectivity plays a vital role in enabling trade, which stems from a globalized supply chain and its associated investments. Air connectivity is pivotal for supporting tourism flows in the region. Every year, 146 million international tourists arrive to the United States and Canada, with 60% of those visitors traveling to the region by air. Another impact on the wider economy comes from the influence that the airline activity has on jobs in the sector, in the supply chain, and the job generated as spending ripples through the economy. In North America, 8.8 million jobs are supported by air transport. Of those, 2.7 million jobs are generated directly by the air transport sector, the airlines, the airports, the air navigation service providers, and the manufacturers. They also support about $1.1 trillion in the region's GDP. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, about half of those jobs and economic activity could be at risk. When we look at Latin America and the Caribbean, air connectivity has been disrupted significantly due to the COVID-19 pandemic, in some cases up to 8 months. The number of unique city pairs connecting the Latin American and Caribbean region within the region and the rest of the world dropped by more than half. In April of this year, there were 680 unique city pairs compared to the 1,780 city pairs during the same period 1 year ago. Across the 5 most connected countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, Peru, and Chile, connectivity levels declined by 85% or more earlier in April. Since then, connectivity has been recovering, although still lagging considerable compared to the pre-COVID levels. Restoring air connectivity in Latin America and the Caribbean countries is critical to support the recovery of our local economies. Air connectivity is vital for sustaining traffic flows, especially relevant for the economies in the region, heavily reliant on tourism as a source of economic growth. Every year, 73 million international tourists arrive to Latin America, with 51% of those visitors traveling to the region by air. To help in the global response of the coronavirus pandemic, the industry has mobilized resources in novel ways to ensure that the delivery of critical medical equipment. Another impact on the wider economy comes through the influence that increased airline connectivity has on jobs in the sector, in the supply chain, and the jobs generated in spending ripples through the economy. In Latin America and the Caribbean, 7.6 million jobs are supported by the air transport industry. Of those, 722,000 jobs are generated directly by air transport. Again, airports, airlines, air navigation service providers, and the manufacturers. The industry also supports about $187 billion of the region's GDP. And due to COVID-19, more than half of those jobs and economic activity could be at risk as well. For Latin America and Caribbean, the lack of connectivity is even more severe than in other regions, given the fact that in many cases, no viable alternatives to transport exist. The region lacks of high rail train systems or adequate roads. The majority of road systems are quite subpar. Hence, over the past months, we have worked tirelessly as an industry to ensure that the necessary infrastructure was available to at least allow for the continued operations of cargo and humanitarian flights. Globally, airlines flew nearly 5.4 million people home on more than 39,000 flights across borders closed in March, with many of those flights taking place in this part of the world. And while the industry stakeholders and regulators such as ICAO, the World Health Organization, or ACI, came together to devise international agreed guidelines on how aviation could operate safely during the pandemic, especially in Latin America and Caribbean. We have unfortunately ended up with a patchwork of rules and regulations, which is not only hampering the restart of our operations, but it is also dissuading people from traveling. Just to cite a few examples, Nicaragua has been in non-compliance of the CART recommendations. Peru still mandates face shields in addition to wearing masks. Trinidad and Tobago has its borders closed. And Uruguay, its borders restricted and requires quarantine. Even though this country is currently the only one in the Americas deemed as a non-high-risk, COVID-safe country by the European Union. What we need from governments in the region in going forward are the following, and we need it urgently. We need a joint approach on implementing systematic testing. We need a collaborative approach on managing capacity now and investing in the future. And we need for financial support for our industry. And most of all, we also need governments to avoid returning to seeing the industry as a cash cow. This week, the International Civil Aviation Organization issued a new document, the Manual on Testing and Cross-Border Risk Management Measures. This document provides governments a high-risk-based assessment tool for using testing programs that could alleviate quarantine requirements. Momentum is building in support of our call for systematic testing to safely reopen borders without quarantine measures. And that quarantines and border restrictions kill demand and is illustrated by the slide, which shows here a snapshot of the regions regarding the upcoming December bookings. Markets that are more restricted with mandatory quarantines, limited destinations, or completely closed to foreigners see fewer bookings. Meanwhile, open countries or countries with testing requirements have more bookings for the month of December. More openness generates more demand and a quicker recovery. Therefore, testing offers a promising way forward to restart air travel while we wait for the vaccination to take place. A further call to our governments and regulators is for more collaborative approach on allocating airport capacity. With operations resuming, we are being faced with an increasing number of capacity restrictions, both on the ground and in the air. We fully comprehend the need to ensure the observance of public health protocols. We must ensure that all options are considered in order to make available the required capacity. As for example, the use of technology, for instance, automated immigrations. In any case, the allocation of slots must be done in coordination with the industry, following the World Airport Slot Guidelines in a transparent and coordinated manner. In Lima, the maximum operations per hour are limited due to the restriction terminal capacity. And in Bogotá, it is operating with the so-called sanitary slots, which are limiting operations of airlines. And these are two key airport hubs, which the region depends on connectivity for the movement of people. Along the same lines, we must also ensure those airports which were suffering extreme capacity issues before COVID-19 do not delay infrastructure improvements which are already in the planning. A prime example is, again, Lima Airport, which was handling nearly twice the number of passengers it was designed for. If the planned expansion is delayed, the airport will not be able to cope with demand as demand starts recovering between now and 2024. Airlines across the globe were provided with $173 billion in financial aid and support from our government. Unfortunately, the financial provided to airlines in Latin America and the Caribbean was less than 1% of the revenues obtained in 2019. Where countries did help, this was achieved mainly through the deferral of payments, reduction in taxations, and waivers of airport charges and fees. With further estimated losses in 2021, governments must continue and need to help airlines alleviate the current liquidity crisis. However, we're seeing the contrary developments throughout our region. Our industry is once again being used as a cash cow as in pre-pandemic times. Yes, we understand that governments are under extreme economic budgetary constraints at the present. Stimulating demand is what's needed right now, and not measures which will have the opposite effect. Just to mention a few examples, Argentina recently implemented a 35% additional tax on international air tickets. Aruba, its air navigation charges will rise by 20% in January 1st, 2021. Plus, airport fees on the same date will also increase by $30 due to a travel insurance that's being implemented. In the Bahamas, passengers, depending on the length of stay, will pay between $40 and $60 in insurance. In Canada, even though that NAV Canada has delayed the fee increases till next year, they are still looking at a 30% travel increase, total increase in spread across 5 years. And in Cuba, just this week, sanitary fees of $30 per passenger will be added to the tickets as per the legislation. This is to be effective next week, December 1st. And in Jamaica, $40 per person will be charged for travel insurance. And although this will not be added to the ticket, it makes the destination more expensive. These examples will not help stimulate demand and will ultimately generate less revenue for government than if the passenger was able to travel without these fees to the countries. Before moving to your questions, let me briefly touch on possibly the best news in the past weeks, and that is the vaccination development. While this is very promising and we must continue to implement and adapt all the biosafety protocols which the industry has devised to ensure that flying continues to be one of the safest environments during this pandemic, we need to continue to work with government in a very extensive manner. Aviation will play a key role in the vaccine distribution, and hence, again, our call to governments to work with us to ensure that we continue to assess the necessary infrastructure to operate in a safe and reliable manner. One more reason for us to renew our call to governments to help us restore public confidence in air travel, reopen borders, and rebuild connectivity. This will ultimately boost economic activity, which will help the government finances. With that, I close my opening statements and comments, and I'm open to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Muchas gracias. As a reminder to all, please pose your questions through the chat function. And we'll start with a somewhat general question, which came from Argentina. So I would say we do this in English and Spanish if possible, Peter. So it has to do with the resolution passed by the AGM calling for opening borders and testing. And I'll read it out in Spanish. Teniendo en cuenta el reclamo realizado por la Asamblea de IATA a los gobiernos respecto a la reapertura de fronteras, ¿cuál es la situación hoy en Latinoamérica, particularmente en Sudamérica, donde si bien se están dando aperturas, aún siguen vigentes periodos de cuarentena? So this has to do with what is the situation across Latin America, specifically South America, on reopening borders and quarantine. So I don't know if you want to make a general comment in English and Spanish on that.
Okay, I'll start with English. We have seen, as you've heard from us in the past recently, we've seen significant movement on the reopening and the removal of restrictions and quarantines in the region. Our region, as you know, as many of you know, is probably one of the hardest hits in terms of country closures. Many of our countries were closed between 6 and 7 months. We have now seen the reopening of borders in Colombia, both domestic and international. We've seen Chile is now removing its entry restrictions for non-Chileans or residents. In Argentina, we've seen a movement of them also reopening borders with neighboring countries. So we've seen a positive trend on that removal. However, we still have countries that are restricted fully. I mentioned Trinidad and Tobago, Venezuela are still, Cayman Islands are still closed until, in some cases, till next year. We still have restrictions and quarantine in Uruguay. We continue to have restrictions in Argentinian to non-Argentinian residents, citizens, or those from the neighboring countries. So we still have a slew of countries that are still impairing a better restart for the industry. And again, we've been working very closely with these governments. We continue to push these governments on the restart, particularly now that we, again, have the biosafety protocols from the ICAO CART. Airlines and airports have implemented all the necessary measures to ensure that the industry is working in a responsible and safe manner, and that air transport will not be a vector of the virus. So our call out, again, is for those remaining countries to begin removing the restrictions and the quarantines. I'll say very quickly, bueno, muchos de ustedes ya saben y han escuchado nuestros mensajes en los últimos meses. Sí hemos visto una recuperación, un cambio de posición de muchos de nuestros países. Colombia reactivó sus vuelos, tanto domésticos e internacionales, Perú internacionales. En la Argentina hemos visto que han eliminado algunas restricciones con los países vecinos. Chile en estos momentos ya está permitiendo pasajeros internacionales o no residentes, no ciudadanos chilenos, para empezar a volar al país con un PCR negativo. Así que hemos visto un cambio bastante importante, drástico. Tenemos que recordar que nuestra región seguramente fue una de las más penalizadas. Muchos de nuestros países tuvieron las fronteras totalmente cerradas durante 6-7 meses y eso ha tenido un impacto. Tenemos todavía países como son Trinidad, Caimán, Islas Caimán, Venezuela, que tienen sus fronteras totalmente cerradas a algunos países. Hay restricciones todavía en la Argentina. Y esperamos y vamos a continuar trabajando con estos países para reabrir las fronteras. Lo importante es que la industria ha demostrado, no solo en la región, pero a nivel global, que está actuando de una manera segura y responsable, aplicando las medidas de bioseguridad y utilizando lo que es el tema de testing o las pruebas para garantizar que el transporte aéreo no sea un vector del COVID-19. Hemos progresado, pero todavía necesitamos más de nuestros gobiernos, sobre todo con la eliminación de las cuarentenas y las restricciones.
Thank you. Gracias, Peter. So now we have a few questions pertaining to restoring connectivity. If we are able to give sort of any estimates when especially Latin America will recover its sort of 2019 connectivity levels. Y lo voy a, bueno, la pregunta viene de México, es en español. ¿En qué momento estima la IATA que se pueda recuperar la conectividad entre ciudades para América Latina? Es decir, ¿cuándo podríamos otra vez, los casi 2,000 city pairs en la región? But if you want to make a prediction sort of along the lines, also recovery, domestic, and then international by 2024.
Yeah. So if you don't mind, I apologize. I'm just going to revert 1 second to the question before. While it was primarily Latin America, I do want to also say that I don't want to leave the focus on Latin America. In North America, there are still entry restrictions of Europeans and Brazilians and some other nationalities into the United States. That is also hampering that recovery. Canada, as I mentioned in my opening comments, still has quarantine and restrictions into that country. So the issue of country restrictions and closures are by no means only related to Latin America. I also want to emphasize that in North America, we also face the same challenges, and as well our call out to governments in both the United States and in Canada. So I just wanted to say that. In terms of recovering the connectivity, we have different success stories in different parts of the region. I'll start in markets like in Brazil and Argentina, where the country really never closed off. Domestic and international connectivity was still available even during the darkest moments of the COVID crisis. We are seeing a recovery. We've seen very good domestic growth in both markets. In Mexico, we're very close, nearing the 95% percentiles in terms of capacity returning to what the pre-COVID levels are, with the Mexican carriers increasing their lift week after week, month after month. So we're seeing good there. In the case of Brazil, we've been seeing a demand growth on an average of 40% month over month during this period of time over the last several months. The expectation that the domestic market or the domestic demand will reach COVID 2019 levels possibly sometime next year. So again, these are very optimistic forecasts that we have for our two largest economies in Latin America and the Caribbean. We should have probably better information that in both of these markets, particularly Brazil, is entering the peak summer months for domestic travel in the coming months. So in these markets, we do see optimism. In the other markets, our expectation really has not changed. We're hopeful that we're going to see a good progressive growth as Brazil and Mexico has seen over the last month. So slow growth over the months beginning 2021. I don't think it will be as quick because these other countries, in some cases, had their markets closed for extensive periods of time. Also, our recovery, particularly on the international side, will depend significantly on what other markets outside our region and within our region take. If there continues to be restrictions or quarantine measures implemented, that will obviously have an impact on how quickly our recovery is. But in terms of our forecast, domestic end of 22, 23, and international is we'll recover hopefully by the end of 23, 24 is what we're expecting. But again, the more our governments help us in helping restart, removing quarantine, removing restrictions, and we have excellent examples in places like Brazil, Mexico, and other countries throughout the region, the quicker our recovery will be. I'll switch to Spanish now. Quiero simplemente aclarar un tema de la pregunta anterior sobre el tema de las cuarentenas. No solo quiero que la urgencia es en América Latina, la urgencia para eliminar las cuarentenas, las restricciones, también están en vigor en Norteamérica. Y ahí hemos estado también trabajando con los gobiernos canadienses, estadounidenses. En Canadá todavía se aplica una cuarentena para pasajeros entrando al país, restricciones de muchos países, y en el caso de Estados Unidos también tiene las fronteras cerradas con varios países como puede ser Brasil y la Comunidad Europea, y necesitamos también que vayan abriendo. Con el tema de conectividad, hemos tenido unos ejemplos de éxito a nivel regional que ha tenido un impacto global. Mercados como Brasil y México, que como saben nunca cerraron sus fronteras, incluso durante los peores momentos del COVID-19, que era abril, mayo, siempre mantuvieron los vuelos, las operaciones domésticas e internacionales. Y estamos viendo ese mejoramiento en esos países. En el caso mexicano, estamos viendo la capacidad está prácticamente al par de lo que teníamos en 2019, alrededor del 95%. Hemos visto todas las compañías mexicanas realmente hacer un trabajo excepcional de traer nuevamente esa capacidad. En el caso brasileño, se espera que la demanda doméstica alcance los niveles del 2019 en algún momento el año que viene, a mediados del año que viene. Nuevamente, buenas noticias en ello. Cada mes, sobre todo en los últimos meses, se ha visto un mejoramiento de una media de un 40% mes encima de mes de la demanda incrementando. En los otros países es un poco distinto, estamos viendo un mejoramiento semana tras semana, mes tras mes, pero tenemos que recordar que nuestros mercados en muchos de estos países estuvieron cerrados durante 6 y 7 meses. En algunos de estos mercados todavía hay restricciones, como puede ser el caso de Argentina, Uruguay, que impide esa recuperación más rápida. Pero en mercados como Perú, Colombia, Chile, vemos y creemos que va a empezar a haber la recuperación más rápida. También va a depender de las restricciones, tanto las que implementan el gobierno como las limitaciones de capacidad que vemos en nuestros aeropuertos. Y eso será fundamental para poder asegurarnos nuevamente que podamos reactivar cuanto antes y incrementar la capacidad. Sin la capacidad va a ser muy lento en obtener esa conectividad que hemos perdido en los años anteriores. Como nuestros pronósticos han dicho, lo que es la recuperación doméstica, esperamos que lleguemos a los niveles 2019 alrededor del 2022, comienzos del 2023, y el sector internacional, la recuperación final del 23, comienzos del 2024.
Okay, thanks, Peter. And I think just for clarification, I think right at the beginning for the English response, I think you had said that Argentina was a market that never closed. I think you meant Mexico and Brazil. Argentina was one of those that was actually closed the longest.
Yes, I apologize if I said that. Exactly. Mexico, Brazil, Chile, and then actually Argentina was one of the longest ones we had.
Yeah. Okay, so I think now we have a few questions also in English, so I think let's move to the English language questions, and this one fits well on the connectivity with regard to Brian Pierce's comments yesterday on secondary hubs possibly losing out during the recovery. Are there any such hubs or bases in the Americas that we believe could not come back for some time? If you have any comments to make on what the networks could look like. Yeah.
Our expectation is that we would hope that all the hubs return to pre-COVID-19 levels of good growth that we have. But this is going to be very dependent on the capacity constraints that we have currently. I've emphasized two examples in Bogotá and Lima that currently, as the markets have reopened and as we are slowly, month over month, growing capacity, now the industry is facing that we're being limited with adding new capacity at these airports. It is so critical at this point that governments and airports abide by the WSG guidelines, that we work in a collaborated and coordinated manner. We definitely understand that there are certain measures, biosafety measures that need to be abide within social distancing at the airports, but we need to work much more closer with our airport partners, particularly with the government mandates that are in place. That is one area I am concerned about, that airlines will want to recover quicker than the infrastructure is permitting us at this point.
Okay, great. And I think in view of the time, let's move to another one in English. Looking at possible distortion in traffic flows. So are we concerned that distorted traffic flows and protective governments could unravel some cross-border liberalization and inflame some simmering disputes, as we've cited, such as we've seen between the U.S. and China? So, I mean, do we see more, let's say, protectionism hindering the traffic in future?
No, we haven't seen anything of that nature at this point in Latin America occurring. There's an example that was provided, but from a Latin American perspective, we have not seen that. Airlines have not seen any sort of barrier to return to the market that they were operating in. The only barrier that we have at this moment is that we have restrictions on the movement of people between some countries or some regions because of the current situation in terms of quarantines or restrictions being imposed by by those people, by those countries, I'm sorry.
Okay. And I have sort of similar questions in English and in Spanish to do with, let's say, reconfiguration, consolidation, and bankruptcies sort of in the Americas. So I don't know if you would like to maybe make a comment on what our view is of what the industry will look like going forward, both North and South, English and Spanish, if possible.
So I think the number that we gave was around $170 billion. Let me just make sure.
Was the state aid overall that was given?
Okay.
Yeah.
So of that, less than 1% has been given in Latin America. In the United States, we've seen significantly more. They've been one of the leading countries, although a second round of government support has not been approved by the Congress. This is a concerning aspect for us here or for the carriers based in Latin America, because next year, particularly the beginning of next year, will also be quite challenging. The financial situation will not improve short term as well, and we need to recall that our region continues to face with political, economic, and social crises throughout the region. We have an economic crisis in Argentina. We have social, let's call it unrest in countries like Guatemala, Peru, Chile. So it is a very difficult environment. In addition to the outdated regulatory framework that we have in many of our countries, I've also mentioned some of the countries now reverting back to all habits of imposing added taxation and cost to the airline industry. And all this are all deterrents of the industry being able to recuperate quicker. These are all obstacles that unfortunately we face on a regular basis in the region, not the same situation that other regions are facing, which are permitting a quicker recovery. That is, again, why our call out to government on the importance of transparency, collaboration, ensuring that the right levels of service infrastructure are made available, costs remain low, which will help us stimulate the market. But if we continue to see the increases that we have that are being imposed on the sale of international tickets or on passenger fees increasing for tourism reasons, that is something that is going to really concern us. This is why this region, unfortunately, has had the most Chapter 11 filings or reorganization filings. This is unfortunately one of the reasons why this region has had the most seizure of operations from carriers. If we do not change, if governments do not help us during these next several months, it is quite possibly that we will see more airlines have to file for reorganization, and even worse, more airlines ceasing operations permanently.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Then I have a further one sort of on reestablishing connectivity regarding secondary routes and hub-to-hub. So I don't know if you want to make some comments on, you said, talked already about the hubs and that we're looking at facing more capacity restrictions than anything else at present. But do we also foresee that maybe some of the secondary routes that were flown within the region might be given up in sort of favor to more hub-to-hub traffic and then having to connect? Pero en español es que desde el punto de vista de la reestructuración de la conectividad en Latinoamérica, ¿qué rutas impulsarán ese proceso punto a punto o a través de un hub?
Well, I'll start with that. Yeah, obviously, the secondary markets are being impacted. We provided before the number of almost half the connectivity that we had in the region we lost. In April of 2020, we had 680 unique city pairs compared to 1,780 before COVID times in Latin America. And this is obviously, many of those are these secondary cities or connection points. We expect that the hub operation the airlines will focus quite a lot on that part of the operations in places like Panama, Lima, Bogota, Sao Paulo, Guarulhos, etc. So again, we need the right playing conditions in order to be slowly increase the connectivity between these other markets. So that's the state of the market. We expect our airlines based in the region to focus on the hub operations. We expect the international carriers to, as they recuperate markets in the regions, is to fly into the larger airports where there's that hub connectivity rather than into the more point-to-point at this point. But hopefully with time, we will see the secondary markets also begin to recuperate. And again, a lot of this depends on the restrictions and the quarantine measures and how flexible our governments are to work with the industry to make sure that we can restart in a viable and effective manner. Do you want me to say it in Spanish, Marcus, or?
Yeah, since it came from a Spanish-speaking question, I think it would be good.
Okay. Bueno, lo que esperamos de la recuperación en la región de América Latina es que la recuperación se va a ver más rápido en esos aeropuertos que tienen una operación más amplia, en un aeropuerto que se concentra más como un tipo de aeropuerto hub, que no en los vuelos directos. Tenemos que recordar que en el peor momento de la crisis en abril perdimos prácticamente la mitad de la conectividad entre ciudades. De las 1.780 nos quedamos con 680. Mucho de esta conectividad era entre varias ciudades secundarias. La recuperación es, nuevamente, en nuestro punto de vista, será enfocada a los más grandes aeropuertos como un tipo hub de distribución y poco a poco ampliándose a puntos entre aeropuertos secundarios. Mucho de esto, como he mencionado anteriormente, va a depender de la flexibilidad, de la colaboración que tengamos con los gobiernos, sobre las restricciones, sobre las cuarentenas y sobre la capacidad para poder reactivar. En algunos casos nos hace muy difícil abrir las operaciones cuando entre un aeropuerto y otro se permite un avión cada hora y media. Eso no es una manera eficaz de poder establecer y reconectar la conectividad. Así que esa es la situación. I will say one thing as an example in English that I just mentioned in Spanish. Reconnecting, particularly between secondary cities or between the hubs in the secondary cities, many of our governments in the regions have imposed that to these secondary airports markets that there will be only one operations per each hour and a half into that city. That is not the way to recuperate the market. That actually will deter. That does not make it efficient for an effective restart. And we have seen this in many markets where an airport only permits one airplane per each hour and a half to operate because of the constraints that they have because of the some of the protocols that are being implemented. This is, again, a call out that we have to governments in order. We have the biosafety measures. The industry had acted in a responsible and safe manner. It is time to open the airports and the limitations, the constraints, to permit more flights to operate rather than just one airplane or one flight per every hour or hour and a half.
Thank you, Peter. Following on from that, I have a more general question on slot allocation and slot guidelines, and why we're asking for the sort of alleviation from the 80-20 slot rule for at least the next season. And this question also throws in the topic of Interjet in Mexico. So if we're asking for the slot rules to be waived, and if there would be, let's say, a further there'd be a bankruptcy in Mexico, how would that then affect slot allocation going forward? But I think maybe just more general, why do airlines actually need the slots to be alleviated, the slot rule alleviated for the time being?
So I'll start. We have two conditions in the region. We have slot restriction, which is not permitting us to grow as the market recuperates and there's market demand, passenger demand. We're being limited to grow because of the regimens or the measures that have been applied by governments. That is not good. Why are we asking for the waivers? Or we're asking for flexibility. We clearly understand the industry knows that it will not be able to return to pre-COVID levels for a determined period of time. We have some countries that are an exception, but the vast majority of the countries will not see connectivity return to numbers later on until 2022, 2024. What we're asking governments is to work with the industry to permit the industry to recover in a responsible manner. It is not responsible to have to abide by the procedures and have empty airplanes fly with almost no passengers. And this is, again, the collaboration that we're asking with governments on flexibility where airlines can keep their slots for a period of time as the industry, the airlines recuperate, and within that period of time, we can bring more public confidence and more people to fly. That's the number one objective. Do you want me to say in Spanish, Marcus?
Just a few comments, yes. Since the question came in Spanish, okay. I think it would be good to understand.
And in the case of Interjet, we don't comment on individual airlines' financial situations. Again, as history has shown in Mexico and in other markets, when unfortunately airlines go out of business, with the market demand, the market stimulus, other airlines take over that void that ceased operations has left. So in a market which is strong like Mexico, innovative, people traveling, we don't expect passengers to be inconvenienced in the middle or long term like in any other market if we were to go down that route. I'll say very quickly in Spanish in terms of the slot issue. En la región, como mencionaba, tenemos dos temas en estos momentos. Uno, que tenemos restricciones para incrementar la capacidad en varios de nuestros aeropuertos debido a las medidas que se están imponiendo por los gobiernos o las regulaciones que están imponiendo, las restricciones, que no está permitiendo que las líneas aéreas basadas en la demanda de los consumidores para incrementar la capacidad. Ya estamos en una situación que semana tras semana, mes tras mes, ya hay la posibilidad de poco a poco ir incrementando la capacidad. Pero nos estamos viendo limitados en mercados como Lima o Bogotá para incrementar esa capacidad. Y por eso queremos el cumplimiento de las normativas que se aplicaban. Lo que sí también se está pidiendo es flexibilidad con las guías o las mejores prácticas del WSG. ¿Por qué? Porque lo que es obvio que el mercado no se va a recuperar a los niveles pre-COVID en la mayoría de los países durante los próximos años. Y lo que necesita la industria, las líneas aéreas, incluso los consumidores, es imagen de tiempo para la recuperación. No es viable que líneas aéreas tengan que volar aviones vacíos para cumplir con las normativas slots, si no la pierden. Y por eso estamos trabajando con los gobiernos de nuestra región. Hemos tenido éxito. La mayoría de los gobiernos de nuestra región han sido flexibles, conocen del tema, y lo que queremos es una recuperación sana donde el consumidor está volviendo a volar. Pero eso obviamente va a tardar tiempo y por eso estamos pidiendo esa flexibilidad. Con el tema de Interjet, ya lo hemos mencionado en otras ocasiones, no hablamos sobre la situación financiera de las líneas aéreas, pero como en cualquier mercado, México no es ninguna excepción, ha vivido por otras situaciones. Cuando ha habido una línea aérea que ha parado de operar, el consumidor ha decidido cómo se va a adaptar el mercado, y en todos los casos siempre vemos que esa vacancia se absorbe por los otros jugadores, los otros actores que están volando dentro de ese mercado. Así que vemos México, como muchas partes de nuestra región, que hay una situación difícil con varias líneas aéreas que el mercado no vemos que se va a ver impactado negativamente. Los otros actores simplemente absorberían esa falta de capacidad o conectividad que dejaría una línea aérea.
Gracias, Peter. Ya tenemos una pregunta que se refiere al dispositivo que muestra el nivel de reservas del mes de diciembre. Y si puede explicar un poquito más el tema, si se debe a las pocas frecuencias o si es por cantidad de personas que quedaron varadas en muchos países. Creo que tenemos que explicar otra vez que este dispositivo nos muestra. No sé si tú lo puedes hacer otra vez, el testing.
Ok. Sí, yo lo hago. Primero yo tengo que decir, y lo hemos mencionado aquí, la industria, aunque a nivel global, regional, durante la peor época, la industria nunca paró completamente de volar. Hubo, and you may want to help me, how many flights, Marcus? 30. Let me see here.
It was around 39,000, yes, yeah. And then there was about, those were about, I think, just under 7,000 in our region, yes.
Pues alrededor de 39.000 vuelos a nivel global y 7.000 vuelos a nivel regional que se realizaron durante la peor época para transportar los ciudadanos de nuestros países latinoamericanos como los ciudadanos de otras regiones para volver a sus casas. Y eso yo creo que es muy importante decir, la industria nunca paró. Estuvimos a la disposición de nuestros gobiernos para asegurarnos que los ciudadanos que querían volverse a sus casas, había esa conectividad. Esta vía diapositiva demuestra lo que es cuando los gobiernos abren sus países, pero demuestra donde hay restricciones y no hay restricciones. En los países donde hay limitación o restricciones, como es Venezuela, Bolivia, Paraguay, ahí vemos peor demanda de conectividad, peor oportunidad para pasajeros poder hacer reservas y comprar. Y en países que han abierto sin tipo de restricciones, como es México, Ecuador, Brasil, etcétera, hay más demanda y más cercano a lo que es los números del 2019. Lo que demuestra en el caso mexicano que es de 47,7% la diferencia a lo que era en diciembre de 2019. Así que es peor que en 2019, pero un país como México tiene más ventas y más cercano a lo que eran las ventas del 2019 comparable a un Bolivia que la diferencia entre 2019 y 2020 es del 78,7%. Pero eso tiene que ver mucho cuando aquí vemos los mercados que no hay restricciones, que no hay cuarentenas de entrada, el porcentaje es mejor, más cercano a lo que era el 2019, que no en esos países donde hay restricciones de entrada, limitaciones de destinos o cuarentena.
Ok, gracias, Peter. Tengo una pregunta sobre el anuncio que vamos a lanzar, el IATA Travel Pass. La nueva aplicación, digital para tener todos los, el pasaporte, información sobre vacunas, información sobre las pruebas, etcétera. ¿Cómo se va a aplicar en América Latina? No sé si quieres hacer un comentario porque se aplicará más o menos al nivel global, ¿no?
Sí, es una aplicación que está desarrollando la industria. Obviamente a nivel global hay muchas aplicaciones que se han ido desarrollando y como industria hemos tomado ese liderazgo para que tengamos un tipo de aplicación que se pueda utilizar a nivel global por todo el sector, todas las líneas aéreas, usando información de nuestro sistema Timatic y que pueda conectarse, comunicarse pues con las empresas donde se hacen las pruebas PCR las pruebas, vamos a decir, en general. Así que estamos trabajando en la herramienta, esperamos tenerlo disponible en breve, pero es parte de nuestra iniciativa para poder reactivar la industria de una manera segura, utilizando los estándares globales y poder utilizarlo por todos los usuarios, por todos los gobiernos a nivel global. Es la intención.
Bueno, gracias. Bueno, nos quedan algunos minutos y algunas preguntas. Sé que hay algunos de los periodistas que están preguntando específicamente las previsiones por país. Estas cifras por el momento no tenemos actualizadas, pero lo vamos a distribuir más tarde en el momento que los tengamos. Just for those who are following us in English, we have quite a few questions asking for country-specific updates. We don't have country-specific numbers updated at present, but as soon as we have those, we will be sending those out to you. So with that, I'm just going to take the few last questions in Spanish. I don't know, Peter, we have one asking about sort of development of fare levels. I'm not sure if you have any information on that. ¿Qué tendencia están observando en el comportamiento de las tarifas aéreas en Latinoamérica? We've seen any developments there recently?
No puedo comentar, nuevamente es un tema comercial, que es el mercado que dicta el nivel de precio de vuelo, pero sí puedo decir, por la falta de pasajeros, y aquí vieron cómo está limitado las reservas a nivel global, o regional, no hay mucha gente todavía viajando. Las tarifas, lo que hemos entendido, son competitivos. Lo que quiere las líneas aéreas es, nuevamente, traer confianza a los pasajeros para que empiecen a volar y en estos momentos hay unas ofertas muy competitivas para volar dentro de la región y desde la región a otras partes.
Ok, gracias. Tengo una específica sobre la cooperación en Argentina y también, en general, cómo fue la cooperación entre la industria y las autoridades en Argentina. No sé si quieres hacer 2 o 3 comentarios sobre esta situación.
Bueno, como he mencionado mucho constantemente en todas nuestras comunicaciones con ustedes, la comunicación con el gobierno argentino, con el ministro de Transporte, Meoni, con la ANAC, siempre ha sido muy abierta, muy transparente, muy regular durante todo este transcurso. Obviamente hemos tenido momentos difíciles, hemos tenido momentos en que las expectativas no se han cumplido, pero en general yo tengo que decir que en el caso argentino ha sido de los mejores países a nivel de colaboración y de intercambio de información, y queremos seguir por esa vía. Hay oportunidades, hay necesidades, tenemos que todavía trabajar en algunos aspectos dentro de reabrir el mercado en Argentina, pero ya vamos por buen camino. Ya se han abierto con mercados vecinos, ya hay el tema de las líneas aéreas poder ya planificar de una manera regular sus vuelos, ya no son vuelos especiales, y eso nos está permitiendo esa recuperación que se busca en la Argentina. El siguiente paso, obviamente, para nosotros como industria es ya eliminar las restricciones con otros países que no son países vecinos. Pero en general, buena colaboración, muy abierta, algunas veces tensa, pero de una manera muy productiva y con el objetivo mutuo, que es poder reabrir de una manera segura, eficiente, y que, como hemos demostrado como industria, que el transporte aéreo no sea ese vector del COVID-19, de lo que hemos demostrado. Pero todavía hay más trabajo que realizar.
Y para, terminar, tenemos más o menos la misma pregunta del mercado mexicano, de México. Están pidiendo también, no sé, si había más contacto con el gobierno sobre el tema de ayudas. Yo sé que había algunos de los aeropuertos en México que han ayudado a la industria durante esta crisis. No sé si quieres hacer un comentario sobre México.
Sí, como he mencionado muchas veces, a nivel gobierno federal ya sabíamos desde el inicio que no iba a haber apoyos financieros a la industria. México sí ha sido un país ejemplar a nivel aeroportuario. Todos los concesionarios o los grupos aeroportuarios del país han aportado, han ayudado, han trabajado muy de cerca con la industria. Estamos totalmente agradecidos a los sistemas aeroportuarios de estos países. Entienden la importancia que este es el momento de no mirar en intentar incrementar costes o poner más barreras, pero es el momento de trabajar de una manera colaborativa para poder incrementar la capacidad. Y eso yo creo que es el ejemplo que tenemos que seguir a nivel regional, que estamos viendo una buena recuperación no solo en el mercado doméstico, pero en los vuelos internacionales hacia México, que poco a poco se va recuperando de una manera muy positiva. Yo creo que ese es el ejemplo regional que tenemos que seguir. Ahora, también con el gobierno hemos estado trabajando muy estrechamente con lo que es el tema del sistema aeroportuario de la ciudad de DF, los procedimientos o el rediseño del espacio aéreo mexicano, muy crítico, muy importante para seguir, y nuevamente estamos trabajando de una manera muy alineada con ellos para asegurarnos que una vez que se implementen estos procedimientos de rediseño será seguro, eficiente y que permita la máxima eficiencia para la industria, tanto a nivel navegación aérea como de las líneas aéreas. Sí tengo que decir, voy a decirlo, necesitamos más cooperación, más colaboración con países como Perú, que necesitamos más alineamiento con Venezuela, con Nicaragua, y seguir trabajando conjuntamente para reactivar. Tenemos ahora una conversación muy extensa con el gobierno cubano sobre el tema de los costes sanitarios, que es muy importante que estemos totalmente alineados, sobre todo que en el caso cubano acaban de reabrir los vuelos a La Habana, y por eso es importante que nuevamente trabajemos de una manera colaborativa, transparente, que ayude tanto al gobierno como a la industria para recuperarse. Y esas son las prioridades que tenemos con algunos de los países en estos momentos: Perú, Cuba, Nicaragua, etcétera.
Okay, gracias, Peter. I don't know, you want to make one final closing comment in English, because we're sort of a couple of minutes over our time now.
Yeah, I'll just say the industry is restarting. We are slowly recovering. The vaccine is very good news, but we need to make sure that governments, until the vaccine is made available, until things become normal, the ICAO biosafety protocols need to be applied, need to be implemented. We need governments to eliminate restrictions and quarantines from Canada to U.S. restrictions on Europeans and Brazilians and other nationalities, all the way down into our region, like Argentina, with their restrictions, quarantines in Uruguay, total closure of borders in countries like Trinidad, or restrictions in Venezuela. We need to make sure that we have the right infrastructure, the right capacity to continue to grow as the industry recovers in places like Peru and Colombia. We need governments not to look at the industry during this dark time and say and begin to apply increased fee structures, as is happening extensively throughout the Caribbean, a region that is highly dependent, the most dependent on air travel for travel and tourism. We see many governments going actually the wrong way, trying to impose high fees on the industry. What we need governments in these moments is actually to reduce fees, so we encourage more passengers to fly to the region. Moving forward, we need that continued collaboration, transparency with our governments to work in a manner that will help us restart and recover and bring those airlines that have not returned, for them to come back to our market. And we will also certainly need close collaboration on how we move the vaccines throughout our region. We need the governments to have the right infrastructure and not impose bureaucratic policies to be able to move these vaccines in a fast and efficient manner.
Okay. Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you to everyone for joining us today.